Samuel is immersed in the rescue of Riley and cannot extricate himself, while Samantha painfully realizes they may be under the surveillance of the enemy. If they flee now, Raven's life might be at risk. If they stay, they may be attacked. How will Samantha make her choice? Join our pack. Subscribe to start your adventure. Chapter 44. The night turned to glass. Samuel didn't stop. Even when it was clear Riley's body would never move again, he continued to force it to try. His movements became harsh, limbs locking with the strain he forced upon them. The longer this went on, the more brutal his actions became, and it was clear to me he wasn't going to slow down. There should have been some ounce of exhaustion in his body, some inkling of tiredness, but the only evidence Samuel had been overworking himself was the sweat pooling around his hair. He paid no mind to it, just as he ignored the blood leaking out of his back. Pieces of his skin were missing, and bullets stuck out from the fresh wounds. The blood from these injuries seemed to paint a picture of death on his back, and that only added to his crazed demeanor as he continuously beat against Riley's chest. Samuel's body refused to fail him, but his face was another story. It was slowly crumbling. His cold and determined eyes slowly melted away, revealing a frenzied glint permanently etched into his irises. His mouth was hanging open and short, ragged breaths forced their way out of it. The wrinkles and lines of his face grew deeper, as if every moment passed was another year taken from Samuel's life. "Samuel," I softly whispered, watching, horrified, as he began ferociously shaking Riley's limp body. However, Samuel didn't respond to me. He didn't even flinch. He only continued shaking Riley, cursing with every passing breath. My own breathing was ragged, and before I knew it I was shaking too. It was only a slight tremor, but it was enough to take over my senses. I helplessly watched Samuel, completely oblivious to the world, and I suddenly wanted nothing more than to curl into a ball and disappear into the trees. I ached to crawl away from this clearing and never look back. I wanted to ignore Riley's lifeless body, to pretend my brother wasn't a monster, curled into a bloody ball across the clearing. I wanted to ignore everything that just happened and run as far away as my legs could take me. But I couldn't. I knew I couldn't, and that was perhaps the thing that terrified me the most. "Raven." I spoke before my mind caught up with my mouth. Slowly, I turned to face her, wincing with the movement. I immediately pushed the pain away, knowing that if I didn't act now, I would give in to the large part of me that wanted nothing more than to disappear. Raven hesitantly stepped forward and crouched down next to me, her gaze avoiding Samuel and Riley. I watched her for a moment, trying to keep my voice even. "We need to get out of here. Can you tell if anyone is still here?" Her face paled, but despite her wide eyes and clear horror, she slowly nodded. "I'll check the perimeter." She stood, quickly turning away from me and heading back into the trees. I watched her body slowly disappear, acutely aware that whoever had attacked us could still be just beyond our vision, lying in wait to fire another round. My gaze fell from the trees and landed on the grass where Raven had walked away. I noticed the gun I'd clung to earlier, the one that had provided me a small ounce of protection. Now it mocked me. Despite this, I leaned forward and took it in my hands once more, ignoring the shaking of my limbs. Once in my hands, I was tempted to throw it as far away from me as possible. But I resisted the urge and took a deep breath. If we were going to be attacked again, I wasn't going down without a fight. A mangled cry resembling what used to be my brother's voice broke through my ears. I whipped my gaze to him, just in time to notice Will's body, or what was once Will's body, go still. It stopped trembling, stopped convulsing, and almost seemed to stop breathing. A shot of panic pierced my chest, and without thinking I tried to stand and run to him. I immediately fell back to the ground, crying out in pain. It began in my ankle, traveling up my body until it stopped at my side. The burning of my old wound intensified, and I felt as if the skin was being ripped apart. My ankle felt a similar pain, but when I pulled my weight off, it dulled. I fought to keep my breathing even as spots danced in my vision. My gaze stayed trained on Will, and after a moment, I saw a slight rise and fall of his chest. This eased the panic I felt only slightly. He was still motionless and still covered in blood. Whether it was his own or someone else's, I had no idea. Samuel suddenly let out an especially loud curse, pulling my attention back to him. When I looked up, my heart broke. Tears were pooling around his eyes, and he still hadn't stopped assaulting Riley's body. He was panicking now though, as if it was only just dawning on him that Riley was gone. I took a deep and shaky breath, closing my eyes for a moment. My attention was being pulled every single direction, and there was still the large urge to shut everything out. But I had to focus. If I had any hope of saving Will, or living through the rest of the night, I couldn't shut down. But I also knew that I couldn't do this alone. Unfortunately, Samuel wasn't anywhere near functioning. He was still maniacally forcing Riley back to life, cursing things I didn't even know existed. Of course it had to be in this moment that I realized how much we needed him. How much I needed him. I opened my eyes and began moving, not thinking about my actions. My body inched towards Samuel, and almost out of instinct, my hand reached out to his shoulder. It hesitated in the air just above his skin, shaking in time with my breath. "Samuel," I called out, closing the distance between his shoulder and my hand. I placed my palm lightly across his skin, ignoring the blood staining my fingers. At my touch, Samuel stilled. His shoulders rose and fell rapidly, but any other movement ceased. His hands were still on Riley's chest, and he was kneeling practically on top of his body. I tried to catch his eye, but Samuel kept his head bent as low as possible. The night turned to glass and silence was heavy upon the surface. It seemed if either of us spoke, it would shatter in an instant, and Samuel would break with it. I bit my lip and took a deep breath, moving to close any distance between our bodies. My hand gently squeezed his shoulder as I used it to pull me closer, and I was sharply aware of the blood that would soon be staining my body. Samuel stiffened with my movements, but he remained mute, seated permanently next to Riley. His gaze was forever on his best friend's face, and though I couldn't see his eyes, I knew tears would be lying in wait. Samuel was broken. I didn't have to look at him to know it. Ignoring the growing pain in my side, I sat up on my knees and placed my other hand on Samuel's other shoulder. Gently I pulled him back. Again he stiffened, refusing to budge from his position. If anything, he turned away the smallest amount, showing me nothing but the skin of his back. I leaned forward, trying to twist Samuel's shoulders as I did so. My lips met his ear, and I again spoke quietly. "Samuel, look at me." He remained still for a moment longer, before finally giving way under my pull. He reluctantly turned his upper body to face me, keeping his gaze low on the ground. It was shielded by the moon's shadows and his dark hair hanging limply across his eyes. Now that he was facing me, I dropped my feeble grip from his shoulders and found his hands in my own. I gripped them tightly, willing words into my touch. I could feel him looking at our hands, so I gave them a gentle squeeze and intertwined our fingers. Almost out of instinct, he curled his fingers into mine, pulling them lightly to his lap. "Samuel," I softly tried again. When he raised his face a fraction of an inch, I forced the unpleasant words from my mouth. "We have to leave." He abruptly shook his head, eyes darting back to Riley's body. I caught a glimpse of his features, and couldn't help but notice how utterly lost they were. It suddenly felt as if a massive weight had fallen on my chest, and for some reason I felt lost too. The feeling was painful and instantly took the breath from my lungs. It wasn't like the pain of my side though. It was an empty and never-ending abyss. I gasped involuntarily, and at that, Samuel finally raised his gaze to meet mine. His mouth hung half open, and water pooled inside his eyes. He let out a harsh breath, and I soon knew the pain I felt was only a fraction of what lied in him. I stared into his dark eyes as tears made their way into my own. I wanted to comfort him somehow, but I couldn't find the words. There was nothing that could be spoke to alleviate the reality he was living. Our attention was abruptly taken away when something moved in the trees. Samuel tensed, leaning towards me to cover my body with his own. I reached for the gun I'd deposited at my side, gripping it tightly as some sort of sick comfort. Before either of us could act though, a familiar voice met our ears. "Alpha." "Samuel." Peyton Bray's hardened tone broke the tense silence. Samuel relaxed slightly but didn't move from in front of me. He didn't have time to respond before Peyton came into view, towing several others behind him. In their midst was Raven, cowering several paces away from the nearest person. One by one the group filed into the clearing. Each time they did, their reaction was the same. They'd scanned their surroundings until they noticed the body next to Samuel and I. When they realized who it was, they stilled. Silence filled the air as each of their gazes fell on their alpha's dead body. I felt the need to avert my eyes, to avoid their horrified stares, but I refrained. I took them all in, feeling a piece of my heart break for each of their disbelieving expressions. Peyton was at the head of them all, but unlike everyone else, he had his gaze trained on Samuel. We were ambushed. Samuel eventually spoke. His voice wasn't cracked or broken but came out strong and full. I darted my gaze back to him, only to find that his face was completely devoid of emotion. Tears were no longer brimming in his eyes, and his mouth was set in a firm line. He growled, "Where the hell were you, Bray?" For a moment Peyton's eyes darted wildly between Riley and the two of us. He slowly sank to his knees, gripping the grass beneath him and bowing his head. We were following their trail. It led back to town. When we heard the gunshots, we came as quickly as possible. You weren't quick enough, Samuel practically spat. The entire forest seemed to tense. After a long moment though, Samuel sighed, and everyone breathed again. He nodded once, turning his attention to the men and women behind Peyton. "Take the body to the house." A few of them immediately stepped forward, obeying Samuel without a second thought. Peyton narrowed his eyes, his gaze darting between Riley's body and me. A look had fallen into his eyes and I couldn't tell what it was, apart from hard and cold. Samuel abruptly stood, pulling me up with him. I tried to ignore the pain that shot up my leg, and to do so rested heavily on Samuel's arm. He noticed but didn't say anything, only wrapping an arm around my waist to steady me. "What happened?" Peyton spoke, his voice low. He followed Samuel and slowly rose from his knees. I watched two men bend down to Riley's body, picking it up with ease. Samuel watched them as well, temporarily ignoring Peyton. After a while though, he sighed heavily. We were helping the new shifter. We were ambushed, shot at from behind the trees. He gestured stiffly to where Will was lying limply. I forced my gaze up to watch Peyton take in the news. His face was unreadable, something deep stirring in his eyes. When I looked into them, he broke his gaze away and followed Samuel's gesture. "Did the boy survive?" Samuel shifted. "So far." Peyton slowly turned back to face us. The men and women with Riley's body had disappeared, but the others remained. There were more of them than I initially thought, and I realized that these people must have been the entire group Peyton had taken to hunt the humans. Every last one of them was now here with us in the forest. In reality there wasn't many, but the 10 or 15 crowding the clearing suddenly made it seem much smaller. Raven still stood a few feet away with her head bowed and hands folded in front of her. "Who shot at you?" Peyton's voice was low. Samuel growled lowly. "Who do you think?" It was then I felt Peyton's gaze rest on me again. But it wasn't my face he was staring at. It was the gun I still gripped tightly in my hand. I felt a sudden urge to cower away from him, to hide the one piece of protection I had hanging at my side. Peyton growled softly, his voice darkening. "That's one of theirs." I stiffened, unconsciously pulling myself closer to Samuel. Peyton noticed this and continued on in a toxic voice. "Where did you get that, Samantha?" Samuel immediately tensed, quickly answering for me. "Don't speak to her." Peyton narrowed his eyes, turning to face the people still in the clearing with us. He raised his voice slightly. "That's one of the humans' guns she has. The ones that killed our alpha." The group collectively tensed, shifting their position so they could more clearly get a look at me. I was tempted to cower behind Samuel, but there was no need. He quickly pushed me behind him. He was processing Bray's words before they'd even sunk into me. "Stand down, Bray. We were just attacked. All of us." Peyton's eyes flashed brightly. "Yet it's our alpha who is dead. And it's you who is harmed." He protected her. Raven interrupted, slowly stepping forward. Her face was still trained on the ground, and her voice wavered. "The beta threw himself on top of her. That is why she is unharmed." All eyes turned back to Peyton, who smiled. "Of course. I would expect nothing less. But that still leaves us with the question as to why the beta's mate has one of the humans' guns. And why you are both here in the first place." He shot an angry look at Raven, who immediately stepped back. This was the duty of our alpha and Samuel alone. If I remember correctly, you two were ordered to stay behind. Now is not the time, Bray, Samuel practically spit. We can answer questions later. Right now we need to get back to town and find whoever did this. Of course, Beta. I'm just trying to guard the rest of us from the human. I didn't miss how Peyton said human and not humans. It suddenly struck me what he was implying, and I immediately gripped Samuel's arm to bring myself back into view and protest the accusation. He seemed to be anticipating this though, and blocked my way to the others even further. Samuel stood up straighter. He responded to Peyton in what could have been the iciest voice possible. Guarding us was something that should have been done before our alpha was killed. Before Peyton could respond, he pushed on, biting his words. Go and scout the area. I want cars waiting for us at the end of the forest. He paused then, lowering his voice considerably. And if we're shot at again, it won't be the humans who need hiding, Bray. Peyton Bray stiffened, his eyes flashing with fury. The men and women behind him cowered at Samuel's tone, and quickly dispersed into the trees. Peyton hesitated for a second more before a smile spread across his face. It didn't reach his eyes or any part of his expression, and I suddenly felt as if I was looking into the face of a murderer. Of course, Beta. Chapter 45 The Pack House. What the hell was that? I bit out as soon as Peyton disappeared into the trees. I would say Samuel stiffened again, but his body never ceased its tension. He ignored my question and called out into the trees for Raven. She immediately reappeared, eyes darting behind her and back to Samuel, who didn't miss a beat. Stay. I need help with Samantha. Raven nodded and came to my side, putting her arm around my waist as Samuel removed his. He walked to the edge of the clearing, practically stalking the entire time. When he reached Will's body, he picked him up without hesitation. Wait, I called to him, tripping over Raven as I tried to walk. He paused and I hesitated, not sure what I was going to say before it left my lips. Don't let him hurt you. Samuel shook his head and walked back toward us, slinging Will's body across one of his shoulders. He's going to be out for a while, Samantha. He paused next to the two of us, glancing warily around the clearing. It was deathly quiet for a few moments as he listened intently to every piece of the forest. Eventually he sighed. Do you hear anything, Raven? She fervently shook her head. No. What did you smell when you were out there? Just our pack. Peyton and the others. Samuel's brow furrowed, bringing me back to my earlier question. I looked at Samuel expectantly. What just happened? What's going on? He looked at me, but for once I could tell nothing from his face. It was hard, cold, and emotionless. Samuel ignored my question again, adjusted Will on his shoulders, and walked past the two of us. I'm going first. You two stay directly behind me. Don't leave my side for any reason. Understand? Raven instantly voiced her compliance, but I could only nod my head. My thoughts were swimming with the encounter earlier, and I wasn't given any time to sort through the currents. That, and the minute Raven acknowledged Samuel, he began moving. Raven darted forward and I was forced to stumble alongside her. She held most of my weight, as any pressure I put on my ankle was enough to send me to the ground. The minutes spent getting back to the entrance of the forest were torture. None of us spoke, and the tension in the air was enough to drive me insane. Anxiety crippled what was left of my body, and with any snapping of a twig, any rustle of the trees, another wave of apprehension followed. Samuel had sent the others ahead to make sure it was safe, but that hadn't guaranteed anything. There was no promise that at any moment shots wouldn't ring through the air again. But they never did. We ended up on the edge of the forest unharmed. As Samuel has demanded, a car was waiting for us at there. There was no one else around, but the car was running and ready for us to take. He didn't waste a second in leading us to it, and after he scanned the interior, he opened the back door and laid Will across the seats. He took up the entire back row, so the only place left for the three of us was the front. Samuel opened the passenger door, jutting his chin towards the opening. Raven carried me forward and the two of them helped me slide into the middle seat. The movement sent waves of pain crashing around almost every part of my body, but I refused to acknowledge them. I bit down hard on my lip and kept my breathing steady, keeping myself distracted with counting my breaths. It only took a few of them for Raven and Samuel to follow me into the car. Samuel got into the driver's seat, while Raven positioned herself between me and the door. She inched herself as close to the door as possible, eliminating any space between her and the tinted window. There were a few inches of space between me and her. But as soon as Samuel settled in, space was gone. The car wasn't large, and 3 people weren't mean to sit up front. "Where are we going?" I voiced as soon as Samuel stepped on the gas, the car lurching forward with the movement. He half glanced at me. "To the house." I felt a sudden lump in my throat. I hesitated. The pack house. Yes. Mixed feelings crept into my heart, and I wasn't sure what to do with them all. I'd never been to the infamous pack house, and frankly I didn't want to. It was an area highly concentrated with countless werewolves, all of whom probably hated me for being a human. Sure, they claimed to live in peace with us, but if that were the case, they wouldn't congregate in one area of town in the first place. "We're going in the back door," Samuel started, his voice emotionless. "There's a lockdown room for new shifters. We have to put Will there. You'll go in the room next to him." "Why?" "I don't want the pack focusing on him or you. Not until I get everything figured out." Images of Riley's dead body flashed through my mind. I stole a glance at Samuel, lowering my head in the process. With the images of Riley's dead body came the memories of Samuel beating hopelessly against his still heart. "I'm sorry," I told him in a small voice. "About Riley." His fingers gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Raven, I need you to stay with Samantha." She'd been quiet up to this point, but when Samuel spoke to her, she nodded almost too eagerly. "I'd be happy to, Beta." He nodded once and took a deep breath through his nose. "Good." Now Samuel suddenly cut himself off. He half turned to look at me, eyes narrowing considerably. I tried not to shrink away from his gaze, mostly because I had no idea why he was suddenly looking at me. His face was still uncharacteristically emotionless, revealing nothing as to his thoughts or intentions. Samuel took another deep breath, watching me from the side of his eye. After he exhaled sharply, he spoke again. "Samantha, you're bleeding." "What?" "No, I'm not." My voice decided to rise an octave. I did a quick scan of my body, checking to make sure my limbs were all intact. Then the burning of my side was pushed to the forefront of my mind. I'd been ignoring it, and up until now I had succeeded. My hands trailed up my hip and under my shirt, just enough so that I could feel the skin around my stitches. Sure enough, it was slick with blood. "Oh," I breathed, slowly turning my head to look back at Samuel. His hands tightened on the steering wheel once more. I watched the speedometer gradually start to rise as Samuel's foot pressed harder against the gas pedal. Change of plans. "Raven, you stay outside of Will's door until I find someone else to put there." "Anything you say, Beta." "I'm fine," I protested, my gaze darting between the two of them. "Really? It's probably just my stitches from when I fell." My eyes decided to linger on Samuel. "Besides, you're the one who needs a doctor." Again he ignored me. No more words were spoken between us, but the car was nowhere near silent. The hum of the engine was loud in my ears, reminding me of the fact that Samuel was pushing the car to go faster every passing second. I didn't dare look outside of the window, knowing that if I did I'd be resigned to accept that Samuel was going to crash the car. Of course we never crashed. In a record amount of time we made it back into town. The car came to an abrupt halt outside a large building, what I deemed to be the infamous pack house. I couldn't tell much about the outside of the house, but the inside was buzzing. Lights were on in almost every window on every floor. Shadows ran across them as figures moved hurriedly between each room. A small door was standing open in the middle of the house, with a short stairway leading to it. No one was outside the door, though, and it hung limply on its hinges, swinging with the wind. It looked as if someone had hurriedly run inside and forgot to close the door behind them. Samuel and Raven were out of the car the instant it stopped moving. Raven was helping me out in the next moment, as Samuel moved to the back to sling Will over his shoulders. Before I could register the pain growing in my side, Raven was moving me forward, following Samuel blindly. The closer we drew to the door, the more noise met my ears. The hum of voices was evident, but loud shouting and harsh demands accompanied them. I was sure that when we stepped inside the house, a slew of chaos would greet us. But it didn't. We slipped inside the door, leaving it hanging open behind us, and dipped to a hallway immediately to our right. Though voices and shouts were louder now, We met nobody to match the voices with. The hallway we traveled was deserted. It took my eyes a few seconds to adjust to the unnatural light streaming through the hallway, and by the time I wasn't squinting, we were standing outside a lone door. You could tell from looking at it that it was heavy. The steel was pristine and looked ready to hold back an army, or keep one trapped inside. Samuel lifted the handle, grunting as he pushed forward. The door slowly swung open, but before I could tell what was inside the room, Samuel slipped inside with Will, closing the door behind him. I attempted to follow, but Raven held me back. As soon as I tried to protest, though, Samuel was back in the hallway. He nodded to Raven, who moved aside and let Samuel take me. She positioned herself next to the steel door, and I had to admit, she didn't look nearly as intimidating as the metal. Without another second's delay, Samuel whirled me away from Raven and started back down the hallway. Now that my eyes were adjusted, I could see the brown wooden flooring, completed by cream-barren walls. We came back to the door we entered, but instead of slipping back into the night, Samuel turned again. We headed down another short hallway, and the further we walked, the louder the voices became. The hall opened into a large room, and all at once my senses were overloaded. The light was even brighter here than in the corridor, and there wasn't a single piece of the room left in darkness. We were standing underneath an archway that led into what looked to be a living room. People ran about the spacious room, bumping into each other, screaming profanities, and rushing to their destinations. Many of them were limping with torn clothes, and most of them had blood staining their skin. There was a fireplace covering the entire wall directly across from us. Light-colored bookshelves sat on either side, and each shelf was filled to the brim with countless colorful novels. The wall on the right was made entirely of windows, and beyond that, even more activity bloomed. Glass doors opened up to reveal a wooden patio, where all the furniture had been pushed to the side to make room for the people streaming in and out of the open doors. In front of the fireplace were countless matching couches and armchairs, each one placed in a specific location. Some faced the bookshelves, some faced the fireplace, and a few sat by themselves in lone corners. Fleece and worn-out rugs sat underneath each one, protecting the dark wooden floors. No one noticed our entrance, at least not at first. Samuel and I stood under the large archway for several moments, taking in the scene before us. Then he abruptly caught someone by the arm, and for the first time eyes met our own. The unfortunate soul Samuel had caught was a middle-aged woman with graying hair. Her dark eyes were alight with frenzy, and when she realized who it was that held her bound, the panic increased. "Beta," she breathed. The word was soft and barely made it out of her lips. As she spoke, her eyes darted to me, but then quickly fell back onto Samuel. Her breathing was heavy, but despite her frantic appearance, she let Samuel keep her bound. Samuel spoke lowly. "What's going on?" The woman's gaze darted around the room. "Everyone's just gotten back. You just missed the warriors coming in. They were attacked. They were ambushed, and didn't have time to get out. We just cleared out the bodies. We were taking care of the others when another group came in telling us horrible things. They said that the Alpha had died." She trailed off, breathless. "Is it true? Is Alpha Riley all right? What happened? Where is Marshall?" She hesitated. I don't know. Last I saw he was carrying Lane away." She trailed off again. "Find him and tell him to meet me in the clinic." Samuel abruptly released the woman's arm, but she hesitated. "Are you sure, Beta? That's where we brought the bodies." He sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Of course it is." "Fine. Tell him to meet us in his office then." The woman nodded and was immediately gone from our sight. Samuel wasted no time in moving either. He kept to the back of the room, shielding me from view. I didn't question him, nor did I protest his actions. With the entire house on edge from attack, the last thing they needed was a foreign human in their midst. My steps faltered as Samuel's pace quickened. He never let me fall though, because when he noticed my struggles, his grip on my waist tightened. He slipped my arm around him, holding it firmly with his own. Using his other arm, he half carried me, letting my weight bear down on his leg. We wound through hallways, climbed stairs, and passed countless doors. I soon lost track of my way as every door, hallway, and room melded together to look much the same. Samuel didn't pause or hesitate as he traveled the house. His steps were deliberate and his pace quick. Had I been walking on my own, my legs would have failed me long ago. Eventually, we came to a stop outside a door that looked identical to everything else. Samuel wasted no time in throwing it open and carrying me inside. The room was dark at first, but Samuel flipped a switch and we were thrown into the white, unnatural light, once more. The room was quaint, and apart from a large wooden desk and deep red armchairs, there wasn't much furniture. The back wall was lined with bookshelves, and another door stood on the wall next to it. Samuel brought me forward and, to my surprise, placed me atop the mahogany desk. He pushed aside paperwork and picture frames, clearing the entire desk for me. I tried to protest, but the minute I opened my mouth, he sent me a sharp look. My voice immediately died, and my protests were left hanging in my throat. Satisfied, Samuel turned away from me and disappeared through the other door in the room. When he came back a few minutes later, his face was even more emotionless than before. He was holding a large first aid kit in one hand, and the other held a hospital pillow and blanket. Wordlessly, he placed the two on the desk next to me, before turning his back to me, folding his arms and staring at the door. I waited in silence for a solid minute. Samuel stood motionless and tense. I tried to watch the door with him, but every time my gaze drifted to the opening, it would be brought back to stare at Samuel. More accurately, to stare at his back. He was still shirtless, and his wounds were looking no better now than they had in the clearing. Subconsciously, my hand slipped to my side as I watched the blood drip down his skin. My shirt was damp now, and I knew underneath the cloth my skin looked much like Samuel's. "Does it hurt?" He abruptly broke the silence. "It's fine," I lied. The burning had intensified, and it wasn't dying down like before. There was little to distract me now. Samuel grunted. "Doubt that." I folded my arms. "Well then, why did you ask me?" He half turned to me, then shook his head, and resumed his stare down with the door. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes because in reality, I had no right to be annoyed. I had no idea what was going on with Samuel, nor why his actions were suddenly so terse. Back in the forest, he'd been beaten down, broken even. Now he was just gone. I took a deep breath. "Are you okay?" "Fine." "I doubt that," I mimicked, raising my eyebrows. Samuel let out a heavy breath but didn't respond. For some reason, his lack of words stung. "What are we waiting for?" I tried again. "What exactly is going on?" "Marshall." "Who's Marshall?" "Pack doctor." "Shouldn't he be helping the others, then?" "From what the woman said." "He's going to help you," Samuel quickly cut me off. "We have more than one doctor. Marshall is the best for you." Slowly I nodded and finally looked away. His sharp tone was stinging more than his silence. Tension blanketed the room, but I didn't have to suffer in it for long. After another minute or so, hurried and heavy footsteps echoed outside our room. When they stopped, the door was swung open to reveal a heavily breathing man. Chapter 46. A sermon in syllables. He was older than I expected. Patchy white hair adorned the old man's age-spotted scalp. A matching beard lined his jaw. Deep-set lines and wrinkles etched the story of his life across his cheeks, eyes, and forehead. He wasn't a large man, but he wasn't small either. What once must have been a tall and lean figure was now a hunched back and sagging skin. "Beta Samuel." I came as quickly as I could. He spoke in rushed words. The man's voice wasn't what I'd expected either. It was light-hearted and showed no sign of his age. If I'd heard his voice without seeing him first, I'd have thought he wasn't much older than myself. Samuel moved to the side of the room, clearing a path for the man. He kept his arms folded and jerked his head towards me. "She needs your help." The man, who I assumed to be Marshall, glanced my way. His eyes light up for a second, their bright golden color glinting in the unnatural light. "Certainly, Beta." Marshall walked forward, and once again his age was shown nowhere but his face. His walk was heavy, but it purposeful and elegant. He scanned me once over. The closer he came, his nostrils flaring as he took a deep breath. I tried not to shy away from him, but the closer he drew, the harder it was. Appearances were misleading, and I wasn't ready to let myself be deceived again. My nerves were on edge, and though my body was tired and failing, it tensed for the worst. If Marshall noticed my wariness, he didn't say anything. He simply smiled lightly and came to stand next to his desk, opening the oversized first aid kit Samuel had placed there earlier. What seems to be the problem? Just above her hip, Samuel answered for me. He'd mimicked Marshall in moving closer to me, and was now standing barely a foot away from the desk. His arms were still folded tightly against his chest, and his mouth was a permanent thin line. Marshall nodded. Without further explanation, the old man lifted up my shirt to reveal the wound. I kept my gaze averted, but the silence that followed the revelation of my bloodied skin gave me everything I needed to know. Samuel abruptly cursed and took another step forward. His gaze snapped up to mine, and for the first time since we'd left the woods, I saw a glimpse of emotion leak back into his eyes. He opened his mouth to say something, but as soon as he did, Marshall sighed. With that noise, Samuel slipped back into stone. It's not as bad as it looks. Marshall began prodding the area around my stitches. He quickly grabbed a cloth and started wiping away excess blood, carefully avoiding my stitches. Can you tell me what happened? This will help me know how to treat it. As he spoke, he turned and brought something else to my skin, squeezing a cool liquid that rolled down my side and fell in a pool around my leg. Samuel answered before I could open my mouth. She fell. I fell on top of her. To my surprise, a small chuckle escaped Marshall's lips. Kids these days, he mused. It wasn't anything like that, I protested immediately, shifting away from the two of them. Marshall's gaze flicked up to mine, then to Samuel, who was still an emotionless boulder. Unspoken accusations danced in his eyes, and he did little to hide his amusement. It wasn't, I stated again, my voice rising. Tell him, Samuel. Tell him what happened. Marshall laughed again, and as he did, something sharp stabbed my side. It was pulled painfully from my skin, and then before I could protest, it happened again. I gasped in pain, my eyes darting to Marshall's hands just in time to see him pulling my stitches apart. Marshall smiled. Just trying to distract you, hon. Before I could register his words, he turned to Samuel. The stitches are torn, and a few were digging into her flesh. But I'm not going to sew them back up. I don't want to risk sealing in any infection. He turned for a moment, and when he faced me again, he was holding a large roll of gauze and bandages. Keep it covered and clean. Change these every few hours until the bleeding stops. The skin has been healing nicely and shouldn't need further treatment. Samuel stepped forward. He was standing next to us now, a look of confusion lining his features. That's all. The blood he trailed off. Superficial. Like I said, it wasn't as bad as it looked. Now that the loose stitches are gone, she should be fine. Just give her time to heal and she'll be fully functioning in no time. Marshall then turned to me, looking me dead in the eyes. Don't let Sammy boy force you out of bed now. You need to stay still and relax no matter what he tells you, especially with that sprained ankle. Samuel let out what was an unattractive mix between a snort and a scoff. This seemed to be the reaction Marshall was hoping for because his eyes light up a little bit more at the sound. If you have troubles with him, you just let me know, hon. I smiled uncertainly. Marshall dropped his gaze and turned to face Samuel. As soon as the doctor caught his eye, Samuel's expression deadened once more. He folded his arms again and gruffly told him, "Thanks, Marshall. That's all we needed." Marshall shook his head. "If you think I'm going to walk out of here with you looking like this, then you're more foolish than I thought. Go up on the desk with you." He gestured to the spot beside me. My eyes widened and darted between Samuel and Marshall. The two were in a sudden face-off, but Samuel was clearly winning. I'd half expected Samuel to lash out at the old man for his disrespectful tone, but he hadn't uttered a word of rebuttal. Instead, the two men stood glaring at each other. Every unspoken word poured into their expressions. Whoever this Marshall was, he was important enough to Samuel not to warrant immediate outrage at insolence. Marshall suddenly shifted and sneered, breaking the temporary silence. "Do I need to fetch Goldie?" Samuel's scowl deepened, but something flashed in his eyes. Though he didn't move a muscle to comply or surrender, Marshall let out an abrupt laugh and all traces of annoyance were erased from his expression. "I didn't think so. Now up onto the desk before I change my mind." Marshall waved his arms about, and to my surprise, Samuel did as he was told. He picked up the box of first aid supplies and forced it into Marshall's arms, sitting down in its place. The old man pulled up one of his chairs and placed the box on it, rummaging through the supplies. "Turn around," he demanded, brandishing gauze and tweezers. Samuel grumbled under his breath, and though I couldn't hear him, I knew it was a slew of curses aimed at Marshall. He did as he was told, despite the flash of annoyance clear in his eyes. Marshall chose to ignore this and began to work on Samuel's back. It was a lengthy process. For several minutes, the room was deathly quiet. The only sounds filling the four walls were the plink of metal as Marshall pulled bullets from Samuel's skin and dropped them into a glass container. I watched his methodical movements, slightly entranced. His fingers were graceful as they simultaneously wiped away blood and handled tweezers. Marshall never hesitated, nor did he think about his movements. It was second nature to him. His hands were just an extension of his brain. Enjoying the show, Marshall suddenly cut into my thoughts, pausing his movements. He looked at me with slightly tilted lips, and for some reason I bowed my head in embarrassment. I've just never seen someone do this before. He resumed his work on Samuel's back, the words he spoke doing nothing to break his concentration. "I certainly hope not. It's not every day you have to pull bullets from the flesh." I shrugged, remembering how it was just days ago I was doing the same thing to Samuel. Except then we were trapped in a hole several feet underground. "You'd think that was the case." Marshall laughed lightly. "Already got her in gunfights, do ya, Sammy boy?" "Not by choice," Samuel growled. I tried not to flinch at the sound and again searched my brain for the source of Samuel's anger. There were countless ideas that flashed in my mind, but I pushed each and every one away. It was easier to live in ignorance if only for a few more minutes. Deep down I knew why he was angry, and that was the very reason I was denying my thoughts. Marshall noticed my discomfort. He paused for a moment before a wicked smile spread across his face. His tweezers were halfway into Samuel's skin, and without warning he twisted his hand and sent them deeper into the flesh. Samuel cursed loudly, flinching forward and whirling around to glower at Marshall. He stood in the same spot, hands lingering where Samuel's back had been just moments before. "What the hell, Marshall?" Samuel bit out. He raised his eyebrows in response. "I was just trying to clean the wound, Beta. The bullets are extremely deep." Samuel rolled his eyes and huffed. He sent the old man a hard look, and when he turned around again, Marshall winked at me. I stared at him with my jaw hanging open and eyes to match my surprise. Marshall ignored the both of us. "You know, I think I will bring Goldie up here. She deserves to meet your mate, Samuel." "No," he growled again. Marshall repeated his movement from before. Samuel cursed loudly, and another smile spread across Marshall's face. "She sure would hate to hear you take that kind of tone. In the presence of your mate, nonetheless." I waited for a cold remark from Samuel, but none came. He simply kept his back turned to the two of us, letting Marshall continue his work. At this, the old man smiled. He pulled another broken bullet from Samuel's wound, much gentler this time. It fell into the glass tray, and before Marshall attacked another, he turned to look at me, eyes glowing. "I don't think we've officially met. Marshall Menard." His smirk turned into a genuine smile as he met my eyes for a moment. "Samantha," I trailed off. "Samantha," he repeated. "A lovely name. A bit ironic, don't you think?" "I guess." The word came out as more of a question than a statement. Marshall laughed and began pulling another piece of Samuel's skin apart. Usually I'd implore Sammy boy to introduce us as proper, but seeing as he's a bit tied up at the moment, this will have to do. I smiled again uncertainly. Samuel cut in. "Now's not really the time for niceness and pleasantries, Marshall." Marshall's face fell slightly. "Quite the contrary. Now's more a time than ever." He hesitated, and as he did, his hands paused. "Is it true?" A moment of silence passed before Samuel let out a long and heavy breath. "Yes." The old man resumed his work on Samuel's back. He was almost done now and only had to dress the wounds. That's what I feared. The smile had fallen from Marshall's face, and in its place was a sullen countenance. I was suddenly looking at a completely different man than moments before and wished he would smile again. It lit up the room with a false sense of happiness and allowed all of us to bask in it for a few precious moments. "You know what this means, then?" he continued. Samuel's harsh tone returned. He clipped, "It doesn't mean anything." "Oh, but you know it does." "It's not possible." Marshall tore off a large piece of medical tape, ripping it to smaller pieces as he placed patches of gauze along Samuel's back. Of course it's possible. Any other thinking is flawed and you know that. What are you going to do? Samuel was silent. Have you considered what's going to happen? Or, Marshall cut Samuel off. Then even you know you can't change it. He finished with the last bandage and tapped Samuel's shoulder. Samuel sagged ever so slightly and kept his back to the two of us. They'll find out, Marshall. Oh, I'm counting on it. Silence fell, and the two of them remained in the same position. Marshall was resting his hand on Samuel's bare shoulder, and Samuel hadn't bothered to turn around. Though my mind was running wild with their conversation, I had the sudden urge to leave them alone. Despite my curiosity, the two of them were dealing with something I felt was far beyond my level. The intimacy between the two men was apparent, and it held no place for me. As if sensing my unease, Marshall turned to face me. He smiled sadly. What do you think, Samantha? Tonight has changed quite a lot for our Samuel, has it not? For the both of you, nonetheless. My brow furrowed. I don't really understand. Marshall's sad smile abruptly fell. In its place was an expression that looked much deadlier on the old man than anyone who previously humored the emotion. It was anger. Clear, raw, and directed at Samuel. You haven't told her. Marshall seethed through his teeth. Samuel stiffened. It never came up. Never came up. Marshall's voice, instead of rising, lowered to just above a whisper. You'd better find a nice conversation starter then. Not much of a choice now. I'm sorry, but what exactly is going on? I cut in, my eyes piercing Samuel's back, begging him to turn around and explain. Nothing, he told me. Marshall's not thinking straight. The old man let out a sudden harsh laugh. I think I will go get Goldie. She'll get a ride out of this one. Samuel abruptly whirled around, swinging his legs along the side of the desk. Marshall had to jump back in order to not get hit, but his glare never faltered. When Samuel came to face us, I saw that a similar scowl was lacing his eyes as well. Not tonight, Marshall, Samuel bit out. Then his eyes scanned the man once over. He softened his frown just slightly and let out a huff of air. His mouth hung open with more words, but before they could be uttered, the expressionless mask found its way back into Samuel's countenance. Marshall's glare faltered. His folded arms fell to his side, and he slowly shook his head. It's your decision, Beta. Samuel nodded but wavered slightly. He opened his mouth to speak again, but a quick look in my direction cut the words from his tongue. Instead, he settled to place a stiff hand on Marshall's shoulder. Thank you for your help. You should get back to the others. Marshall agreed, then smiled. It wasn't like his previous smile, though. It was an expression to mask what he was truly feeling. The same mask I realized that Samuel was fighting desperately to keep in place. He sighed, then concluded, you should both be fine. Just stop gallivanting through the forest and getting shot at. His gaze drifted to me. If your pain is too much, tell Samuel. He knows where everything is. It should get better. Just stay close to him. Before I could respond, the old man straightened and turned away from his desk. I better be off. If you have any questions, you know where to find me. How is everyone else looking? Samuel suddenly asked, his voice quavering. Marshall shook his head, letting his eyes fall to his bloody hands. I'll tell you in the morning. He left the room quickly and quietly. His previously pounding feet were nowhere to be found, but instead had been replaced with the dragging step of an old man. As soon as Marshall was gone, Samuel stood. He began cleaning what was left over from Marshall's work, keeping his back turned to me the entire time. A flash of hurt hit my chest, but I desperately pushed it away like everything else. I blinked several times before asking, what was that about? Nothing. I pursed my lips, taking a deep breath. I'm not an idiot. I know something's going on that you're not telling me. Is that something new for us? Samuel glanced at me from the side of his eye. He began throwing away pieces of bloodied gauze and tucking stray supplies back into the first aid box. Abrupt anger filled my heart, but before I could retort, Samuel had finished his task and disappeared through the door to my left. He was gone for several minutes, and in that time my anger died. I was too drained to hold on to it and fight back everything else. Samuel returned, now wearing a dark-colored shirt. He ignored my presence and began picking up the countless piles of paper that had been carelessly thrown off the desk. I gave him several more minutes of silence before finally sighing. Samuel. I resisted the urge to tap my fingers against my folded arms. What? Can you just tell me something? He sighed, letting his shoulders sag. He moved to sit in the chair that Marshall had pulled up to the desk, and when he sat down, he leaned his arms on his legs and hung his head. There's a lot going on, Samantha. My arms unfolded and fell into my lap. I understand that much. What do you want from me? What was Marshall talking about? Samuel rubbed the back of his neck, groaning under his breath. Nothing. His tone wasn't filled with as much anger as previously, but it was now laced with exhaustion. I closed my eyes, counting my breaths. It took me upwards of 20 before I finally responded. I understand if you don't want to talk about things. But, from what Marshall said, whatever is going on involves me. Is that true? He hesitated. To an extent. Then I'd like to know. Samuel was quiet for a long minute. When he finally spoke, his voice was drained of emotion. I can't deal with that tonight, Samantha. Not on top of everything else. I've got to find Bray and figure out what happened and what he's told the pack. I let out a long breath, twisting my fingers together in my lap. I hadn't really expected Samuel to tell me anything, so his reaction didn't come as a surprise. I was only growing tired of not knowing what was going on, and thought maybe this piece of information could distract me from the other thoughts threatening to spill from my eyes. Can't you tell me what's happening with Bray? Or the pack? Or Will? Anything? He raised his head to stare at my feet hanging limply off the side of the desk. I don't know. That's the problem. Will's shift was going normal, you and Raven showed up, then we were attacked. In all honesty, it was probably the humans. There's not much else it could be. Blindly I nodded, taking in any information Samuel would give me. Something scratched at the back of my mind though, and his words, no matter how hard I tried, didn't settle right with me. What are you going to do? Samuel straightened, sitting upright in the chair. I have to talk to Bray and sort everything out. Preferably tomorrow, but knowing him, it won't wait. He finally turned to look at me. I need to know the whole story if I'm going to confront him. Everything that happened with you and Raven. He's going to use it. My voice came out hesitantly. Bray thinks I had something to do with Riley's death. Samuel nodded. That's what it sounds like. What do you think? I asked before I could stop myself. Then, already knowing the answer, I continued. That's why you've been so closed off. I was beginning to tread dangerous waters, but no matter how I tried, I couldn't pull myself to shore. These thoughts were bursting inside of me, despite my harsh efforts to push them away. I'd barely had time to process the night's events, but as each moment came to my memory, a dark cloud covered my heart. With each scenario I sorted through, I was slowly realizing my never-ending faults. What if questions swarmed my brain, and before I knew it, I was entirely convinced that I'd single-handedly caused the night to end the way it did in death. Suddenly, I couldn't look at Samuel. I'm not closed off, he sighed. I took a deep breath. You've barely said 2 words to me until now. I paused, lowering my folded arms and twisting my fingers. You think I had something to do with it? My words were phrased carefully. If Samuel was only thinking of what Bray implied, the conversation would continue on and my thoughts would be left to myself. But if Samuel believed I was the one to deliberately kill Riley, he'd understand my vague accusation and would undoubtedly affirm my suspicions. And then the castle of cards we'd slowly begun to build would start to fall. But this time it wouldn't be Samuel's fault. It'd be mine. Samuel was quiet for a long time. Eventually he told me that's what I thought at first. He paused then, letting the sentence sink into my soul. When he continued, I barely registered the words. But then I realized how stupid a thought that was. My brow furrowed and I bit my lip. What do you mean? I know you didn't have anything to do with it. How can you be so sure? Samuel finally met my gaze. His dark blue eyes swam in time with the ocean's currents, each emotion sweeping up and under the others. You wouldn't put your brother at risk like that. I'd like to think you wouldn't put yourself at risk either. They did shoot at all of us. My fingers finally stopped twisting with each other and fell limply to my lap. I didn't want anyone to die. I know. He stared at me, trapping my eyes with his own. Though he spoke 2 simple words, a sermon was laced within the syllables. Those 2 words were so simple, and spoken so softly that I almost missed it. So much rested behind the phrase. I could feel it when he spoke. It was as if the small sentence was all he needed to say to convey the fact he wasn't angry, hurt, or untrusting of me. He'd considered the very thing I was hinting at, and he'd moved on. There was no blame, no hatred. But that couldn't be true. Even though I was staring at his eyes, and felt the truth pouring out of them, I refused to believe it. He should have blamed me. I was the human. I had a gun. His alpha had died. I'd barely gotten hurt. However, where there should have been betrayal and fear in Samuel's eyes, there was only understanding. It didn't make sense no matter how many times I wrapped my head around it. Samuel couldn't let something like that simply go. He shouldn't be able to put aside what appeared to be true and trust someone who wasn't even of his own species. But he had, and I suddenly felt terrible. He'd done all of that, and I'd barely bothered to entertain the thought that it was my actions that got Riley killed. Where did you get the gun, Samantha? Samuel's question finally reached my ears and startled me out of my thoughts. He'd been asking this same question for the past few minutes, and I'd done nothing more than continue to stare into his eyes. What? He repeated the question for what I was sure was the 10th time, his annoyance starting to show. Where did you get the gun? I hesitated, gathering my thoughts and trying not to grimace. Cade. If Samuel trusted me before, this was sure to shatter it. Then again, maybe it was better this way. Maybe then I wouldn't have to face him and force myself to push back the guilt that was now threatening to eat my insides. Cade? Samuel questioned lowly. I nodded, biting my lip. He was one of the ones who first helped me out of town. Part of the humans. Samuel stilled and tilted his head. I could tell where his thoughts were going, but I did nothing to clarify. Facing this was easier than facing the truth. How did you get it? His voice was barely above a mumble. I want the full story. My head dipped to my chest. Of course, Samuel would want clarification. It would require a tender mercy for him to believe what I'd implied. But, being the perfect soul he was, he'd never believed a betrayal from implications. Raven and I were trying to get to the forest. We stayed in the back alleys, and when we heard someone coming toward us, we hid behind a dumpster. It turned out to be Cade and his brother. I took their gun and Raven knocked them out. He met my gaze, and once again his eyes were a storm. You knocked them out? I nodded. One of them was already unconscious. I didn't want them to attack us or come after us. Raven did it, really. It was her idea to put them in the dumpster. Samuel raised an eyebrow. The dumpster. We thought it might look suspicious for them to be out on the street. We didn't want to get caught. Samuel sighed heavily. I'll send someone to find them. If they're injured, they can't have gotten far. They can tell us where the rest of them went. That's it. I questioned incredulously. You're just going to believe me? What do you mean? Is there more? No, I bit my lip. Why do you even trust me? After what happened? I trailed off, attempting to stop the flood of words threatening to spill. But the dam broke and they came. If it wasn't for me in the first place, Samuel cut me off. His lips thinned and his gaze fell to the ground. It's not your fault. I'm sorry if you thought I was upset with you. I'm stressed, Samantha. Of course it's my fault. I said it wasn't. That doesn't make sense, though. I quickly shook my head. You should be thinking what Peyton thinks. You should. I'm not. I desperately wanted to raise my gaze to meet Samuel's, but I kept it firmly planted on the ground. But it's true, and we both know it is. You shouldn't be trusting me. I've given you no reason to. That's not true. You've helped me before. You're helping me now, believe it or not. I've also run before. And broke out of the apartment and kept things from you and hated you and blamed you and caused Riley to stop. Samuel cut me off. He was quiet for a long moment, letting out several large breaths. I know what you're thinking, Samantha. Just stop. I told you it wasn't your fault. I know it wasn't. And I don't believe you. Samuel abruptly stood and began pacing the room. I listened to the echo of his shoes on the hardwood floor, and each step hitting the wood was another shot to my side. Samuel was broken, and here I was, opening a forbidden box of pain the very night it was inflicted. Let's just drop it. I tried to salvage the situation. We both need rest. I'm sorry. No, Samuel spoke without missing a beat in his paces. No, we might as well finish this. It was going to come up sooner or later. I'd rather talk of this than anything else right now. My mouth hung half open in confusion. What else could weigh so heavily on Samuel's mind that he'd rather discuss the death of his best friend? And more importantly, the woman who caused it. You made a mistake, Samantha, he continued, ignoring my silence. I'll let you have that much, all right? I nodded, looking up momentarily to watch Samuel's movements. His hands were placed on his hips, and he traveled the length of the office in barely 3 strides. As he spoke, his mask began to slowly chip away. But you have to understand. I've made mistakes too. I'm not innocent here either. I forced you into a life you never wanted. I couldn't protect you. I've snapped at you, taken you for granted, caused your family to disappear and your brother to turn into something you hate. I'm not oblivious to it all. I've just been selfish. He stopped pacing then, turning to catch my eye before I had the chance to lower my gaze. His face held a determination I hadn't seen before, and it trapped me in a single glance. Samuel's eyes held such intensity, such emotion, that I couldn't believe he'd tried to ever hide it. Mistakes aren't who you are. They're just a part of what we've done. We can't change it, and there's no sense in hating ourselves for it. He sighed and slowly began walking back towards me. Trust me when I say that there are many things I wish I could change. Before I met you, I wasted years trying to find a way to do just that. I'm still trying. But no matter what we do, we can't change the past. And we can hate ourselves for it, or we can learn and not make the same mistake twice. Samuel was standing in front of me now. Our eyes were locked in an embrace that not even reality could break. 1,000 different stories danced between us, each one being told through our breaths. That's why I can't let you go, he eventually finished. And that's why I trust you. I couldn't find words adequate enough to respond to what Samuel had spoken. He seemed to understand this though and smiled warmly. His hand found my own, and without hesitation, my fingers laced themselves into his. Eventually, with my heart pounding in my ears, I breathed my response. Just like that. Just like that. I don't understand how you do it. What? Forgive. Trust. Any of it. I don't deserve it. None of us really deserve anything, Samantha. But we give it to each other anyway. He sighed. It's not always a good thing. And you have more reasons than anyone not to trust. You've only ever been around the worst. My eyebrows hung heavy over my eyelids. I thought of James, knowing that was exactly who Samuel was hinting at. But then I also thought of Riley. Of Bray. Certainly, my life had been tainted before I even had the chance to form an opinion. But then I thought of Raven. I even thought of the brief interaction I had with Marshall. Lastly, I thought of Samuel. That's not exactly true, I told him. You're not all the worst. I finally raised my eyes to meet Samuel's, knowing he'd been watching me this entire time. My eyes met his just in time to see a sad smile creep across his face. In a moment it was gone, replaced by a knowing smirk. You mean to tell me you don't hate me? I hid my smile. All I'm saying is you're not the worst. He shook his head, any trace of humor suddenly gone. I wouldn't say that just yet. Why not? You practically just poured your heart out and I'm supposed to hate you for it. That was only a piece. I searched Samuel's eyes for a further explanation. Where's the rest? He dipped his head, and I knew in that instant the conversation was over. Before he even cut me off, before he redirected my attention like I'd done with him so many times before. I need to go find Bray, Samuel mumbled. I resisted the urge to sigh. Of course. Don't let the story end. Subscribe to continue our Wolfpack legend.